Now, Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird joins us for more on this reaction regarding the withdrawal of this bill. Mr. Bird, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. Now, Media Monitoring was a part of the civil society organizations that were in opposition of this bill, and I can imagine that the withdrawal is to your pleasure.
Good evening. Yes, it certainly is something we welcome wholeheartedly as well. In fact, it was possibly one of the most extraordinary parliamentary hearings we've ever been in over 25 years of doing this work, where almost every single entity, whether it was a civil society body, a private media house, a Chapter 9 body, the SABC themselves, everyone was saying what a dreadful bill this was. It was an extraordinary thing to have all these diverse parties agreeing on it. So really the only question was how it got to Parliament to begin with, especially because it subverted the policy process and it offered precisely nothing in terms of any actual solution for SABC, other than to waste yet another year on something that we should have been a year backwards on in trying to work out financial solutions to SABC's crises.
So what do you think the implications are of withdrawing this bill, especially on the SABC and its current operations?
Well, none, frankly. I mean, I think that's what we do need to see now is a level of urgency from the Department of Communication and Digital Technologies to be looking at what viable financial models can work for a public broadcaster. But there were also a number of scenarios and options put forward by the previous SABC board to the previous ministers to urgently address and alleviate some of the other financial issues that SABC is facing. One of them, if you remember, government moved ahead without consultation and certainly with massive disregard for the poor by switching off the analog signal. And so that's cut a huge amount of audience for the free-to-air TV channels. So that was a very detrimental thing that the government did. And now you're faced with the scenario where there's a huge loss in audience. There are all these rising issues and challenges being faced from over-the-top services, particularly digital. And SABC has not got anything to kind of fight back with that. So we need to look at what kind of short-term solutions we can put in place. And then we need to say, well, what is our policy environment? Because the other thing that's almost as embarrassing as this bill that has been scrapped was the fact that we're 13 years into our current policy process. Our current policy is over 25 years old. So we're in desperate need as a sector for new audiovisual digital policy. And at the moment, that isn't there. The last ministers decided to sit on their hands on this instead of taking it forward. This is a good opportunity to revitalize that and move with a great deal of urgency to get that new policy settled.
So talking about previous ministers, I mean, now the current Deputy Minister, Mondli Kungs, has come out in opposition of the withdrawal of this bill, and he says that canning the bill would be viewed as an attempt to delay the SABC's capacity to be financially sound, transformative and developmental. What's your take on that?
Well, I suppose he'd have to argue that, seeing as he was in charge when he put that horrific bill forward to begin with. The simple reality is, and you can ask him this if he's prepared to come on your program, challenge him to cite you the actual text of the former act that he was so desperate to support that would have done anything to alleviate the SABC's current financial problems. Saying you're giving the minister another 3 years to come up with a new financial model isn't doing anything to alleviate that crisis. If you look at the bill, much of it was a copy and paste from the 1999 Broadcasting Act. That's not anything new. That's not anything that's going to change the SABC's fortunes. All it was going to do was recreate more of the same and load it into a deeper state of crisis. So I think the real question is why would any minister acting in the public interest possibly want to support such a horrific example of a draft piece of legislation? I mean, it was embarrassing from every perspective. As I said, it was the voices at the public hearings on this, and people can go back and look at the YouTube. they can see every single one of them was condemning this bill.
Were there any parts of the bill that you did agree to?
Well, I think that's important that you do look at developing an SABC Act. I think that's probably a good idea, but we need urgently to have a better policy. We need to maybe be making some very small changes, possibly to allow the SABC to receive funds in other ways. But again, this is already catered for in the existing Act, because if you look at the section on funding that was in the draft bill, it's almost exactly the same as the one that was in the 1999 Act. So it's not that we need new mechanisms, we need imagination, and we need them to be able to, and Parliament and the Minister to be able to say, these are the urgent interventions we can take to help alleviate SABC's funding. One of the obvious ones are the Centec fees. I know that SABC previously had put in a request about this, that this should possibly be covered by the state. It's one of the SABC's biggest debt points. So that would be something quite easy that they could do. And then we could look at the other mechanisms around how else they can start to raise funds and what the other ideas are globally. Because again, this isn't a unique problem for South Africa. And again, that bill just didn't even begin to take into account the emerging digital environment, which was very much a product of 1999 thinking put forward in 2024, 2023.
So going forward then, how should government be regulating public broadcasters such as the SABC? What recommendations are you making now that the bill has been withdrawn?
I mean, I think they're load actually, and working with SOS, there was a draft bill that was produced and worked on a few years ago now that was put forward to the department. There's a great starting point. You need to be looking at international best practice, what's happening with other public broadcasters around the world, how are they mitigating the various threats that emerge from digital media, how are they mitigating, the fact that you've got to fund this thing publicly when governments around the world, especially in developing nations, are under huge pressure to deliver on some of the other basic services. So you've got to find ways that we can actually be creative about making sure that we still have a public broadcast. What is good news, I think, is that increasingly we're seeing that more and more content on the social media channels is untrustworthy. It's something that we don't know if it's real even. It's a place where we're not sure what's real and what isn't, which means that increasingly people are going to need to go to sources that they can trust and believe. So that'll be entities like Newzroom Afrika and entities like the SABC, and you need that diversity and that news and information ecosystem that has integrity, that has credibility, to be able to ensure that our democracy can survive, because these are questions that go well beyond just the sustainability of the SABC, but to bigger questions of how we're going to fund and support journalism in our democracy.
How important do you believe are civil society organizations and the voices that they bring in conversations such as these in order for the public to be represented where their voices are not heard?
So I think that's, as civil society, we've got particular mandates and we've got particular ideas about what the public broadcaster should look like. In our case, in the case of SOS, they're driven by a desire to see a strong public interest content services, strong public interest programming. That means programming that speaks to the views and interests of marginalized groups, programming and news content that's independent, credible, accurate, and fair, especially in an election period, for example, programming that caters to South Africa's diverse and multilingual universe, programs that reflect the stories and views and ideas of all people in South Africa, and that can help build and consider social cohesion. So civil society, we are able to bring those issues because political parties will speak to their mandates. Government, in many instances, tends to overflow and cross their thing, making them think that the government mandate is the same as the public mandate. And very often you'll find that it's civil society bodies that are going, hold the phone here. We need to make sure that this is in the public interest and not just in the interest of a narrow, small group of interests.